Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah Richardson, Executive Director of the International Human Trafficking Institute. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon in our series of The Way Forward, the intersections of race, gender and class, and labor and sexual exploitation. We are beginning this conversation with three experts in the field around how sexual and labor exploitation impacts boys and trans youth. And I would say since the start of this movement in Georgia in the 2019, we have primarily focused on the impact of exploitation on girls. But what you will find this afternoon is that boys are very vulnerable in unique ways. And because of our lack of awareness, that we've kind of hidden it under the rug, and in some instances are responsible for this incursion and exploitation that takes place because we lack the knowledge and we know how to act. So I'm honored to have this conversation with three people. Judge Jackson, Judge Jackson, you and I share a background. We are both native Atlantans who attended Atlanta Public Schools, but you went on with a bachelor's degree in business administration from UGA and both your MBA and JD from Georgia State University. You were the first in your family to go to college. You spent the first part of your career in the corporate world, and then you left AT&T and began practicing law and was appointed an associate judge in Fulton County Juvenile Court in 2009. Dr. Redd joined the Covenant House as executive director in 2018. She came with 28 years of experience in the field of social work. She was formerly the vice president of placement services at Chris 80. She earned her BA in psychology from University of Michigan, her MSW and PhD in social work from Clark Atlanta University. And she has been a continuous licensed clinical social worker since 2000. Jennifer Swain, this is a very personal introduction of you, Jennifer, because since you joined YouthSpark in 2008, I have seen how you have grown to become a nationally recognized expert in this field. It's because of your passion and your commitment to young people and your willingness to speak truth to power that you are a fresh voice and face in this community, in this area. And it's because of you that a lot of the progress that we've made along this line has happened. So Jennifer, thank you very much for being a part of this. So I'm going to start the conversation in the order of the introductions. Judge Jackson, I'd like to open with you because I would like for you to share with the group the role of juvenile court. A lot of people don't understand the complexity of juvenile court, and particularly its importance around addressing the needs proactively and reactively of vulnerable youth. And I especially wanted you to focus on, after your overview, around juvenile court and the intersection with boys and trans youth and how the court intervenes in the root causes of labor and sexual exploitation. So Judge Jackson.
All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Philip Jackson. I'm a juvenile court judge. Juvenile court is a little bit different because the cases we hear usually involve neglect or abuse. And we're supposed to do what's in the best interest of a child. We hear two types of cases. One, we hear cases, delinquent cases. In that particular case, the child or youth has done something wrong. And other cases are more like we call dependency cases of deprivation, which means somebody's done something wrong to a youth. And these cases, what we have to look at is that most youth, what we want to do and what history and everything has taught us is we want to try to keep kids with their family. No matter what type of environment that a child is born in, child always feels a little more comfortable at home. It doesn't matter. And they will always run back to home because that's what they know, even though that might be the most dangerous place for them. And in these cases, when you start talking about trans youth and abusing of youth, that's one of the problems because a lot of times the abuse starts at home. It starts by somebody that they know or a family member. Now, when you start talking about kids that are being abused, the thing you have to remember, especially when it comes to trans youth, and LGBT and different youth is that people that prey on these kids, they prey on them for a reason. They're predators. They look for certain things. And a lot of times these kids are going through identity crisis. They're trying to figure out who they are. And because they might be different than most kids, they're subject to bullying. They're subject to being treated as outcasts. And that's how people find a way of getting into these kids. Sometimes these kids run away. And a lot of times it's not a sign standing up on a child that's saying, I've been abused or I'm being neglected. Because they tend to keep to themselves, and you really have to spend some type of time. And a lot of times when they come into a courtroom, I'm not going to see that because they're not before me that long. It's usually a social worker or a doctor or a nurse or a teacher that's spending some time with somebody that's going to recognize it and has to bring it to their attention. The thing about where doctors and nurses come in is sometimes these kids get sick, but because they get sick and they present themselves, they're going to have certain indications. If they're being sexually exploited, for instance, when they're examined, a doctor or nurse will notice that, and that will raise a red flag. When they're given their medical history, if the right person's not around to answer questions or they're reluctant to give answers and it doesn't make sense, that might be a red flag. Kids that are being abused, another thing is that they tend to act out. There's anger management issues. So a lot of times when you see a kid that's misbehaving, it's not necessarily that that kid is bad, but that kid is actually being neglected or abused, and somehow that's how they're crying out to try to figure out what's wrong with them. Now, the thing you have to understand in Georgia, and I keep saying a child or a youth, is that in Georgia, a child or youth is anybody under the age of 18 when it comes to dependency, okay? Once you turn 18, you're an adult. You know everything, you don't need any help from anybody, and you're out there on your own. But if you get picked up or brought in before your 18th birthday, then you're available for all the services that the state can offer. And usually they try to provide those services in the home. The thing you have to understand is that when somebody comes in, they don't always check to see who the parent is. Somebody brings a kid in and said, this is my child, this is my grandchild. They're gonna treat them. They're not gonna do a fingerprint and do a background check. They treat them and they let them go. And a lot of times, that's why they have to be careful when they bring in kids like these or children like these. So, you know, they talk about the new reality. When I came up, you know, you always used to hear stories about not getting in a car with a stranger, and guys used to talk about it. And people be walking down certain streets and you can see it. And you knew the bad spots, so you knew where the predators might be. But nowadays, it's almost like a new reality. With the internet, you don't see that. All this stuff is going behind the scenes. And the thing about it is the way we spend our resources or how we find these kids. If we're just looking for females that's been abused and our system tend to do that, then they ignore the boys. I mean, statistics say what, 1 in 4 females have been abused in their lifetime. But statistics also say 1 in 6 males. So all the examples you see in the press and the resources, they tend to be looking for girls. But when it comes to boys, it's a different story. And boys are bullied just as much as girls. And both are bullied because of their sexual identities, because of their intellectual levels. Anything that makes them stand out different might be an opening for a predator to come in and take advantage of.
Judge Jackson, thank you for that. I want to ask you, how has the court been impacted since COVID-19?
Well, basically we're doing virtual hearings. We're not doing hardly any in-person hearings. So, but we set it up, and the witnesses come in. We can get used to that, but what happens is, like you might have seen on the news, because kids aren't going to schools, a lot of times teachers are the first people to pick up on abuse. And when you're not in school, it's not that abuse stopped because of COVID. It's just that nobody is seeing these kids to recognize it. Social workers a lot of times, instead of making in-person visits, they have to do virtual visits. So when you're not there in person and you can see certain things, if you can be alone with somebody, because one of the basic things is when you talk to kids, that one of the first things they want to do is kind of separate them from their parents or anybody else to really see what that kid is feeling, and let that kid talk to you. Probation officers, the same thing, virtual. And you can understand that in this environment, they're really trying to cut back on in-person contact in all different levels. We just don't know how far it is. But when you look at the court system and you look at people, well, you know, I can't go there. And a lot of times where these kids are being abused, these are in bad areas that you may not want to go for more than one reason.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about child abuse. The National Child Abuse Hotline reported that they received more calls in the month of April than they had in their 24-year history of child abuse. And the majority of those calls were children crying out for help. So you definitely, and thank you for pointing that out. Just because the reports are not there doesn't mean it's not happening. So thank you. So Dr. A, I want to talk to you about Covenant House. It has a very distinguished long history of working with homeless and runaway youth, not just in Georgia, just in this country, but throughout the world. So tell the group about the services that Covenant House provides here in Georgia, specifically around the percentage of boys or trans youth that they are serving, and finally, the impact that you have seen in your work with COVID-19.
Thank you, Deborah, for having me and to be a part of this panel. Covenant House Georgia has been here in Georgia since 2000. Across the nation, Covenant House has been in existence almost 50 years now. And specifically here in Georgia, we serve young people ages 16 to 24 who are overcoming homelessness and escaping trafficking. And we are an organization here that provides emergency crisis shelter, more long-term shelter. We provide a lot of wraparound services, intensive case management, mental and physical health and intervention. We do street outreach, going out and combing the streets of the city of Atlanta. We've worked in partnership with Georgia State University to do a count, and really finding year after year, we have about 3,300 young people who are experiencing homelessness in the city of Atlanta, which Covenant House Georgia, depending on how you look at it, fortunately or unfortunately, served over 1,800 of those young people last year. This is particularly important in the work that we do, and we are the largest network of providers that's working with young people experiencing homelessness across the United States. This is particularly important for us because we do intersect very heavily with young people who are escaping trafficking. In our population of young people we're serving, you asked specifically about males as well as transgender youth. We do serve about 40% of the population we serve self-identify within the LGBTQ plus community. And what we see is that there's over 80% of young people that we serve locally that are African American, and 56% of them are males. And so in that, we do see pretty alarming numbers of young people that we're serving who have at least 72% of them have experienced some sort of trauma that Judge Jackson was speaking of earlier. We also see that about 30% of those young people have been engaged in some sort of sexual exploitation, and specifically about 20% of them historically have been involved in sex trafficking. Since the pandemic, we have really seen an increase in the numbers of young people who are being exploited and those that are being trafficked, especially those of young males that we're speaking of. And like Judge Jackson spoke of, a lot of times young males don't want to speak of this, or sometimes people don't understand how they're being taken advantage of and how they're being exploited until they really start to understand and gain the knowledge and education around this very egregious crime. We have seen an uptick in those numbers because our young people are experiencing alarming rates of unemployment. They have lost housing because of unemployment, because they can't pay for their housing. We have seen a lot of young people return to us or come to us for the first time because of school closures and dorm closures. And so our young people, unfortunately, are being taken advantage of because they have desperate needs to care for themselves and, you know, have a need for housing and have a need for food and shelter, you know, those sorts of things. And so we have seen an uptick since the pandemic.
Thank you for that. I want to ask the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask of the panelists, please put them in the chat box. And after we hear Jennifer's presentation, we'll go to the chat box and answer some of your questions. So Jennifer, YouthSpark, you all have been at the intersection of trafficking in the juvenile court from its inception. So tell us about what you're now seeing in the work on the percentage of young people who are boys and trans youth, and again, how your work has been impacted since COVID-19. So I believe, Jennifer, you have a presentation.
Yes. Thank you, Deborah, for that. And I will share my screen and just kick off my presentation, but also just also appreciating that, you know, it is probably almost 20 years to the birth of the movement that you are a founder of. And so I just want to acknowledge and say thank you for being one of the founding mothers of this movement and allowing us to stand on your shoulders. And I think it is really interesting that we are talking about this boys 20 years later. So just kind of thinking of that and holding that, it's really interesting. And YouthSpark, through the evolution of our journey from the Juvenile Justice Fund, we've always been based inside of Fulton County Juvenile Court. I tell people all the time that we cannot do what we do without juvenile court and them and the county allowing us to serve on the front lines. And that is really the basis that we're able to get these youth as quickly as possible. And for most of all of our journey, we were serving only girls who were victims, and then we moved into girls who were considered to be high risk. And it was in late 2012 when we received our first case of a young male. And what was most interesting about that is that even the court personnel who had very good intentions didn't know what to do, didn't know the language to use, and it was an uncomfortable situation, not just for everyone seeing that we had major gaps in the system, but seeing that we had a young person here and we didn't even have the language to make them feel comfortable. And so it was really that referral and research that we conducted that on males that led us to our youth services center, where we now serve girls, boys, and LGBTQ youth. So I'm going to share just a little bit of our approach and presentation for all. And let me know if this is okay. Just nod at me if you can see my screen here. Okay. And so one of the things that I really wanted to talk about here was just sort of recognizing that, you know, we have to talk about the boys. And, you know, I never want to, you know, mistake anybody for knowing what human trafficking is. But just as we talk about it for girls and adults and minors, you know, foreigners and domestic and citizens, there's all these different terms that you guys might see, but, you know, at its core, anytime that there is, I'm sorry, something is in the middle of my screen here. Let's see how I can move that. Sorry. The law defines it at any time human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor or services against his or her will. I love that the federal definition has his or her stated in the definition. The one thing that I'd really like to bring to people's attention is that there's an exception for minors, that if you are under the age of 18, you are automatically considered a victim, no matter, if you're a girl or a boy, or what gender you use, what sexual orientation you have, and you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. But girls and boys are exploited differently. It looks differently. And I just want to make sure that people recognize that, because it's important for us to recognize that as we think about what types of community-based solutions we need and what type of policy we need to be able to hold the systems and individuals accountable. We conducted research back in 2013, and it was really kind of Georgia's first count to be able to see what it looks like, what male victimization looks like. And we really wanted to determine how many males in Metro Atlanta are affected by commercial sexual exploitation, and realizing that it's very important to be sensitive to gender terminology. And the goal is to be inclusive, no matter what box you check or what you identify as. Adolescence also has both legal and societal definitions. Under 18 for most policy that's created out here, but under 21 for most purposes. As you heard earlier from Dr. A, Covenant House sees young people up to 24. So when we're talking about young people, it's very important to realize that there are exactly different points that Judge Jackson brought out, especially when it comes to the justice system between 18 years old and 18 in one day. But we also sought out to do this initial research in 2013 to help elected officials, service providers, mandated reporters, parents, and everybody in the metro area understand how, why, and where adolescent males are bought and bartered for sex. I'd like to thank the Robert and Polly Don Foundation for helping us to spearhead this when we really didn't know how to create a methodology. But at its core, you see here that we were in 2013, Backpage was still up and kicking. We know because of the federal legislation that those sites have been taken down. And we also know that a lot of this activity is happening on apps. It's not just out there in plain view, but it's still happening on the internet. So here are just some of the sites that we were looking at. And what we recognized is that we needed to sort of pose ourselves as a young person, soliciting to be able to find out what that market even looked like. One of the key factors out of that 2013 study is that many buyers are straight men seeking discretion. A lot of times we recognize that young girls get paid a certain amount for the sex act. What we found from this study is that it's really men paying more money, top dollar, to keep their secret that they are having sex with young boys. A quote from a survivor: if you're out, you can get it pretty much for free anytime you want. It's the guys that don't want to, be out and that don't want to get caught. They will pay the price that they need to because they don't want you to tell anybody about their secret or their private desires. One thing that we recognize for girls, we talk a lot about pimps and how they are exploited. But what we found for young boys, especially in the metro area, that there are these mentors that are out there. So if you're a part of the LGBT community and you're experiencing homelessness or out-of-home placement, abuse in your home that lead you to the street, there are these mentors that are waiting for you out here that sort of serve as this introduction to the street life, whether that's trading sex for money, getting drugs, how to stay under the radar of social services, how to ensure that you are not, in criminal danger. These mentors are not necessarily seeking outward right to be a pimp, but necessarily showing you the way and giving you the lay of the land, and teaching you even about survivor sex. What we also found is that the drug and the sex markets are intertwined. It's almost like, hey, you're going to be out here doing this to take care of yourself. You probably want to get high first. You want to make sure you're self-medicating. So we recognize that that's a big portion here of how these two markets are intertwined. I wanted you guys to be able to take a visual look at where the buyers for this, because I can talk to you all day about stories of young boys that we've seen, but I think it's always important that we never just talk about the victims rather than and exclude the adults who do this. So here are just ping points from where people were calling in when we presented ourselves as this young person out here. And as you think, okay, well, it got to be all Atlanta, right? This gives you really the down and dirty and tells you that it's coming from all over the state. And before, people used to think, okay, it's Atlanta problem. You know, let's concentrate in the city, in the urban areas, or on the south end of town. This really allows us to see that this is something that is out there. Taking it out a little bit further. Yes, this was in Georgia, but we had people from Hawaii connecting with us. So it speaks to the fact that people still want to come into Atlanta to do this, but the bulk of it is homegrown. Giving you guys just a little bit of the language that people were using with us, you know, hey, I'm just looking for somebody to chill with. I'm going to be respectful here. If you want a father figure, that's one of the parallels that we've noticed between girls and boys, that there's always this vulnerability and this lack of love in the home, this lack of connectedness and family that almost make kids increasingly vulnerable despite any other abuses. I think the neglect is one I really want to hone in on here. And that another one is, it's a financial plug. I want to elevate you. I want to give you this money. You deserve to be in the Four Seasons. I can help you in this world. I can help you achieve your dreams. And I think what that says to us is that our LGBTQ community, we just lack the support and services that we really need. Our research director, Renee Shelby, and worked with Georgia State University on the Atlanta Homeless and Runaway Youth Count. And here are a couple of the key findings that we want to share here. There are just over 3,300 youth experiencing homelessness in Atlanta on any given month. I know that Dr. A will talk a little bit about this more, because Covenant House was definitely a key partner in this survey. But it just goes to show you guys that we need to be talking about race. We cannot exclude that from the conversation. So 55% of those coming through that 3,300 are Black. 51% of the homeless youth have experienced one or more form of human trafficking in their lifetime. 36% have experienced one or more form of human trafficking while they were specifically out of the home. Homelessness is a major vulnerability. We have to begin to provide service and outreach for that as well. Another part that I want to share with you guys, and you can take a look at the homeless and runaway youth count. If you just Google that, you'll get to that website. But there are certain risk factors for sex and labor trafficking as well. Gay and bisexual boys are at greater risk for trafficking than their straight counterparts. Trans youth are at greater risk for trafficking than their cisgender counterparts. Homelessness is a very key thing here. And those who've been homeless for more than a year are at greater risk than those who've been homeless for shorter periods of time. Boys with higher levels of trauma are at a greater risk. And those who have been in the system already have an increased vulnerability. And Deborah, I know you've been talking about that link of foster care for a very long time, and that's important here. I apologize to everybody because I have just a few more slides, but I want to give you the information so that we can have a discussion, and you can take these talking points to go and find the study for yourself. The Atlanta Youth Count also affirmed previous study that show boys are a hidden population, as Judge Jackson said. You don't really see it. And I invite people to think back to when Shirley Franklin did her Hidden in Plain View report. It was in front of us. And so we just now need to learn how to teach advocates and those on the front lines to see it, and even one up how to see it through the virtual screen because of the pandemic here. But the key takeaway from this study is that Atlanta is not unique. 8.6% of all males in the Atlanta sex trade are under the age of 18. Again, 18 today does not mean you don't carry the same life experiences of a 17-year-old, but the system will definitely treat you differently. The majority of individuals who interacted with our ad came from outside of the metro area, and 1 in 6 individuals who interacted were geocoded outside of the state. The key takeaway is that the call is coming from inside. This is not necessarily just coming in the airport. This is a homegrown thing. Our Youth Services Center has created a new program track where we provide everything that we used to provide for girls in an early intervention approach to boys as well, and LGBT community. But one thing that we've learned is that boys are almost always framed as the victimizers. And I will tell you guys that when we started doing the work with our boys, we weren't even prepared to ask a question about sexual abuse and sexual assault. And I appreciate you, Judge, for sharing that we were able to realize that 1 in 6 boys have experienced it, but no one's talking about it. And now you have more women talking about it, but we have to begin to do that. But since January of 2018 to now, We've had 253 referrals. 138 of those are boys. I want to really point out what they had, because the violence in the home, 30% of it, when we want to talk about why they leave the home, why they run away, 53% of them are not connected to school. 12% are dealing with bullying, and 8% are actually referred for exploitation. And if you don't know how valuable adverse childhood experiences are, it tells us a wealth about what's happening to that kid. And these are boys who might not have been referred to us and would have slipped through the cracks if we had not expanded our services and our partnership with juvenile court. The bottom line here is that we have served boys and trans girls who've lived many of these experiences. Our Connections and Expressions program specifically provides culturally competent and a safe space for us to talk about this with boys. And talking about human trafficking with boys looks like opening the door to becoming allies, but also talking about sexual abuse and what that means. We have to address youth who've experienced labor. And one of the things that we recognized was that, boys are being recruited, just like trafficking, to be recruited for traffickers. Boys are being recruited to go out and commit crimes. We found that there was a very large car theft ring last year in the city of South Fulton, and that there were several young boys coming through juvenile court. What we found was that these young boys were sought out by adults in the community who taught them how to drive and break into a Ferrari or a Porsche, and would give them money to do it, and almost would promise them that if you got this car back to me, then you'd get off with a juvie record and you'd be able to go ahead and have this extra money. That is recruitment in a different form, but we still need to make it a priority that we don't limit this to sex, but we also talk about labor trafficking as well. This summer, I was very pleased for us to pivot due to COVID, and we created the summer youth program that we were able to provide new skills and opportunities to young people who would otherwise not get it and get a paid stipend. We had some of these young men who've been on the news who were water boys. They're standing out there and they're trying to get money. They're looking for a way. They have this entrepreneurial spirit. So I really look forward to working with the court to continue to find ways for us to provide alternatives to incarceration for these boys, but also give them the skills that they need to become entrepreneurs, and recognizing that this also is a part of an important conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Jennifer. It was very comprehensive. So the last question I would like to ask each one of you is, now that this audience knows this, what is one thing that you would like for them to do as a result of the new information that they have? I'll go in the same order we started. Judge Jackson?
Basically, be aware and educate others. Because I think I said it before, Ms. Swain and Dr. Redd said, a lot of times it's right in front of you, but if you don't know what to look for, you don't see it. There are homeless people sleeping up on the freeways and up on the bridges where people don't see them because they don't look for them. Same thing about children being trafficked or children being abused. Once you become aware of it and look for certain signs, then I think the key is to educate others and then try to be active. How do you be active? Well, you involve the community. You educate your elected officials, because that's how who control the resources and the money. The police department, the schools. The main thing is not to ignore it and to take action.
Thank you. Dr. A?
I definitely applaud everything that Judge Jackson mentioned, but what I will say a little to add to that is that there is such a need for people to engage and stop ignoring and stop looking and turning the other way. It is certainly as obvious as the morning sun that these kids are being exploited, that they're being trafficked, that they're experiencing homelessness. I think everything that we have to do to get involved, from volunteering to putting your money where your mouth is, to engaging and voting and legislation, and all of these things are very impactful ways that people just have to dig a little deeper and figure out, how do you get involved? Educating yourself and understanding the struggle is the first thing to do. But then once you know, then what are you challenging yourself and other people around you to get involved to be able to stop this? It is calling those people out who are exploiting our children. It is a time to cease, oh, well, that only happens because, you know, we're always making all these different excuses of why things are happening and why we turn the other cheek or why we don't get involved. But this is hitting closer and closer to home and becoming more and more egregious every single day. And those people who know about it, have seen it, witnessed, hears about it, and they're not doing anything about it, is just as guilty in creating the platform for these sorts of crimes to happen. So I really challenge everyone to get involved and to be able to educate your children to be able to speak up, because a lot of times they know what's happening. They just don't know where to take the information and what to do about it. But if you have fearful people who aren't doing anything about it or speaking up about it, then collectively we cannot prevent this from occurring.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you that. Jennifer?
You know, I think as I'm sitting here, I keep hearing the word be inclusive. And I think that's really important because as we've seen over the last couple of days, I mean, a couple of months with not only just the pandemic, but, you know, the racial injustice that's been thrown in all of our faces, it's really important that if you care about human trafficking victims, then you have to keep that same energy for boys and trans youth and boys of color. And we've done a really good job of separating and putting these things into silos for people to care about them. But now we really just have to encourage and give people the space to level up, right? And change their minds. And if you are out here having a conversation on human trafficking, use the language and stand up for LGBTQ youth. Like, you have to be able to make it real. And this is not about sex. This is about kids who've been abused, the neglect, and the adults who take advantage of kids. And I think that is the one thing that I would say. We embarked on a partnership with Georgetown University because one of the things that we realized is even in juvenile court, we are not collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data. We don't ask the questions, and I am grateful that the court's leadership is supporting us in this new initiative, because we can't even create policies and tell the story if we don't have the data. So I'm really excited that working with Georgetown University and other collaborations nationally, we will begin to be able to not only provide the training to help probation officers and court staff be comfortable asking about sexual orientation and gender identity, but being able to recognize that it is a critical part of what we need to know in order to serve these kids. And so if you're creating a training program for kids, make it inclusive to LGBTQ youth. If you want to be able to create something that you have a standard for how your organization serves this kid, connect with an organization that's doing this work and culturally competent on the ground so that they get what they need either, and as well. So I just encourage everyone on the line to keep that same energy. And when you're passionately talking about what's happening to kids, don't be afraid to say it. Use the term. Let's not run away from it. I know back in the day, we would kind of shy away from talking about race with human trafficking because we wanted everybody to care. Let's be bold enough now to talk about gay and trans youth and tell the real horror stories that are actually as heinous, if not more, than what you've heard about the girls.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I mean, it's just that particular thinking that we realized that we really needed to start talking about this exploitation through a racialized, gender, and class lens, because it's an open secret that the vulnerability from prior sexual abuse, poverty, low school performance, Black and brown and mixed youth, they are absolutely the number one group, the groups, the higher groups who are being exploited. So we cannot remove race and poverty from this. So thank you, Jennifer. There are some good questions in the—
I add one more thing?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just want to talk about our systems just for a brief moment.
Mm-hmm.
talk about systemic racism and we talk about systemic poverty, when we talk about inequality and lack of inclusion, you know, these are things that we need people to get involved and use their voices and use their sphere of influence to be able to really tackle the core of why these sorts of egregious crimes are even occurring in the first place, right? So when we think about that, when we talk about that, when we move into action to do something about it, we're talking about systemic issues and opportunities such as, you know, developing our education, developing career paths, developing opportunities for people who would not have otherwise had an equal playing field into these areas, so that we can prevent things that feed trafficking, such as, you know, living in poverty, lack of opportunity, lack of education. You know, it is these sorts of things that are pipelines to not only homelessness, which feeds trafficking as well. So it's just, I wanted to kind of think about that a little further and to really encourage people to think about these systems and utilizing their sphere of influence to tackle these crimes against our children.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of good questions in the chat box, and I'm going to power through them as quickly as I can so we can cover them. One question asks, is there any training on our education within the court system about trans youth issues? Judge, are there any trainings that juvenile court judges receive around this?
Judges, yes. When we go to conferences and we get our annual training, that's one of the hot issues that they're always talking about now, and more so than ever about the trans youth because of the vulnerabilities. And for the same reason, those are the kids that are coming into care. Those are the kids that are being abused. So they usually go over that. The problem is, when you talk about systemic, is that we need to bring in the whole community. Like, you got one YouthSpark and you got one Covenant House, but they can't handle all the kids in Atlanta. And I imagine they feel bad sometimes because if their house is full, they have to make referrals or they can't bring somebody in. And somehow we need to understand that when you're dealing with a systemic problem, this didn't happen overnight. And it's gonna take, we have to look at the long run. And when we put resources in, we need to be smart. You can't just throw money at it. You need to think through, get the experts at it, and have some type of long-range plan to treat it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we touched on before we started the conversation is that, so a child is under 17, goes through the court system as a male or trans youth. There are no facilities in Georgia, therapeutic facilities in Georgia that this young person can go to for treatment. So that's a huge public policy oversight that we really need to correct. Because how do they heal? How do they get back to their full potential if there's no place in this state that they can go for treatment? So thank you for that. Another question is about the whole, and Jennifer, I saw it up on your screen, the whole sugar daddy, sugar baby phenomena. Will you talk about that for a little bit? And has YouthSpark or even Covenant House had any experiences with that?
So I recently was contacted by Stephanie Davis, who had become aware of some information. And for anybody who may not know, sugaring is a concept in which people, primarily young people or college students, are approached to get a sugar daddy of some sort. And I think that while we haven't experienced firsthand someone who's sort of gone through those sites, what we do recognize is that our very own Georgia State University has a large percentage of sugar babies on that current site, and that you can also get a discount if you have a .edu email address. And I think it's really important that we talk about this because we oftentimes get caught up in the conversation of seeing how it happens. Trafficking, was this person taken somewhere? Were they held against their will? But it's really a big continuum, and at its core, we really have to talk about what healthy relationship looks like, and why are people looking for economic support in these places, in these ways? Because there's a lack of resources in the community. And so for us, I recognize that it's always been this, like we spoke about earlier, this mentorship. Let me show you the way. I'll be there for you in this grooming process that really sort of provides that listener. Now, this is where it connects with girls and boys. The exploiter and the trafficker will say, I'll talk to her as long as I need to be sure that she'll do whatever I want her to do. I'll listen to her fears. I'll talk about who's bullying her at school, and I'll ask the questions. Because that's why they say, parents need to know, I'll talk to your child longer than you will. I will accept their sexual orientation and you won't. I will let them be gay and will not, hold religion over their heads. And so one of the things that I think is important is these types of sites and these entities of sugaring exist because we are not looking at the continuum, and that we are placing people in these situations, because to me, it leads back to economic opportunity. And at the end of the day, I always challenge people to think about it in this aspect.
Yeah.
There are really, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, finish.
Think about the jobs that are available for trans youth in particular. I just want to talk not about, like gay and lesbian. And for Atlanta to be one of the gayest places in the South, we should really be ashamed of the lack of services that we have here, because we wave that flag proudly, but we don't have the services here. So are we really as inclusive as we want to be? But when you are a young person and you don't have the money for your surgery, you can't take the hormones that some people are afforded the opportunity to do that and get, facial and get your hair and all these things done. Who wants to hire somebody that has the appearance of a male, but you're wearing lipstick? And who's going to be complaining that I feel uncomfortable that this person is serving me, or this person is in this position of employment? So we have to realize that if we want to take off the table the survival sex option and the sugaring option that's readily available and accepting and inclusive, if we want to take those off the table, we have to talk about what opportunities are we providing. And if we are taking away that stigma that says, because you look in that way and I don't understand or believe it, then I don't want to be served. And until we begin to talk about the options available for these populations, we're never going to get rid of survivor sex in these type of sites.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And we touched on one of the questions, which is about recruitment. They asked what was the most common, and I believe the panel would agree. The most common form of recruitment is when that young person is approached by someone who promised to give them the love and support and attention that they need. That is the number one way that young people get recruited, finding what they feel is a gap in their own current life situations. Another question was around, there are a lot of words become slang words and new words that we use, such as sugaring as an example. Is there somewhere a directory or a website that people can go to, particularly parents, I would think, to understand what some of these words mean? Have any of you seen that anywhere?
I know, here locally, Georgia Equality has sort of been the backing arm for the Atlanta Coalition for LGBT Youth. And so I'm going to drop their sort of the contact information that I have, that I found for them through that. But then also the only thing that I really know of outside of that is the information through the Trevor line, Israel. But I'm going to drop a couple of links into the chat for you guys.
Okay, that'd be great.
I think anytime there's some, and the language and the slang changes so rapidly,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think for me, there's two greatest resources that I use in order to keep myself up to date, besides having conversations with young people and understanding their language. That one is I listen to their music and try to figure out and translate what that means. And if there's something I don't know, then I ask a young person. The other piece of it is I use the Urban Dictionary. I'm always Googling stuff on the Urban Dictionary, and sometimes it's very shocking stuff. So you have to be, you have to prepare yourself and be very open-minded and not use that terminology in a way that you're discounting the conversation and the language that our young people are using. You have to be very open-minded and transparent if you truly want to have these conversations with our young people.
I agree. The last two questions, one of them is, excuse me, a question about there's a history of trans youth and LGBTQ youth being treated differently in court systems. Is that the case in Fulton County Juvenile Court, Judge?
Well, I guess we try to treat everybody the same, but then you have to know things. You know, when people come before a judge, they don't say I'm gay, they don't say I'm trans, and you just look at why they're there, what's happened to them, and what you can do for them. Judicial system, especially if you're looking from a delinquency side of the law side, you want to treat everybody the same. You don't want to give anybody a special break. But then again, when it comes to rehabilitation and trying to make people whole, that's the thing about juvenile court. It's more about treatment than punishment.
Right.
And that's when that comes in, but you have to know about it. And you have to know about the signs. And that's where it takes the good counseling. That's where it takes the good probation. You talked about training. It's not just the judges that need training. Doctors need training, the nurses need training. When they see these things, they can pick it up. Teachers need training so they can do it. Probation officers need training. The counselors need training. You see it in the news every day by police officers, especially now. You know, it's the training that makes a difference. And when you can, a lot of times you don't know if somebody's sick, if they're having a mental health episode, or they're actually just doing something wrong. And the quickest way you can pick up on that and to treat somebody for that is the best way to handle it. The one thing we've mentioned, and I think we need to probably emphasize this, is that we really need to start at a young age. Because when you start talking about a 16-year-old or 15-year-old, they may have been treated this way for 4 or 5 years or longer. And it's hard to reach them. We need to try to reach them as soon as possible when they're young, because as soon as you reach somebody, or someone or a kid, the more resources you can give them and the better you can help them. You know, we talked about the thing I hate about abuse and about the people taking advantage of these kids is that when you're that young, what we don't look at is that they miss school. Do you know what it's like to miss the year of school and try to catch up, or to miss a couple of years of school? And when you're talking about middle school and you're missing a couple of years of school, it's a different world altogether. They can never catch up. It's hard, and they're limited. So that's, I don't know if I probably answered a different question, but I tried to answer your question and include it too.
Yeah, no, you were great. And I think that that's been the theme of this conversation, is that all of this is an intersection. You can't separate it out. It's not just one thing or the other. And we have to look at this systemically across everything. So you're right. If you've missed school, then you're more vulnerable to survival sets. Absolutely, this is how it's all connected. The last question is, someone asked if there were laws that needed to be passed that punish buyers. So
let me answer that question.
Okay, please do, because I haven't answered it, but I'll let you go first.
Because one of the things I learned when I first started practicing law is that we have enough laws now. We just need to enforce the ones that we have. I meant, you have theft, you can't steal. But why do you need to have electronic theft and theft by conversion and doing different things like that? You can't hit anybody, that's a battery. But you know, you keep coming up with all these different laws. What we need to do is enforce the laws we have. But we need to have the right system when you have the right judges and prosecutors. That's where the systemic thing comes in. When you have the right law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges to have the proper discretion and to make the right decisions, you don't need all that other stuff. You're just you're taking away their discretion. It's like when you give people mandatory sentences. You talk about treating people different. That's how you treat them different. When transsexuals or LGBT or people would have mental health issues come up, you have to be able to handle them different and treat them different based upon who they are, as opposed to just these laws, you got to do this, you got to do that.
Yeah, you said that so well. The laws are there, and the issue is that we need to create the public will for those laws to be enforced. Law enforcement needs to make the arrests and give the proper charges. The city police, the chief of the police, is the person who's appointed by the mayor. So we have leverage about, we don't believe our police department is doing the right thing. Mayor, we want you to make a change. The district attorney that brings the cases to be prosecuted is elected. You should not elect district attorneys who aren't committed to this issue. And finally, Superior Court judges are elected. So it's not an inactive or a way that we passively can address this, as you said, Judge. Each of us have to take on and have the public will to make this end. So on that note, I want to thank each of you. You have just been very, whole wealth of knowledge. I wish we could have gone on for this another hour. I want to invite all of you to come to our next conversation, which is be next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. We're going to be featuring Jerome Elam, who is a survivor, a male survivor of sexual exploitation, domestic violence, and sexual abuse. It's a very compelling story, and we'd love for you to come and be a part of listening to him and being part of that conversation. And then finally, I invite you to please attend our trainings. We have 2 free trainings that are Zoom trainings. One is an overview of labor and sexual exploitation, and the second is what you need to know to keep young people safe online. We've already mentioned since COVID-19, there has been an exponential increase in children being approached online by predators, children being abused. So if there's a young person in your life, please go online and register for that free training. So thank you again. We appreciate your active engagement. And we know that now that you have learned something, we hope that you will share it with someone, say something, but more importantly, we hope that you will do something to end sexual and labor exploitation. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.